The battle lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. By any measure the Keth War Council applied, it was a decisive victory. The human fleet had consisted of 47 vessels, ranging from light patrol craft to 3 heavy carriers that the Keth Tactical Assessment had designated as the primary military threat in the outer sectors. The Keth Assault Force had deployed 212 warships. The engagement had proceeded almost exactly as the simulations projected. The human fleet had fought with the specific quality that Keth intelligence had come to expect from human military engagements, which was aggressive, adaptive, and ultimately futile against a force of sufficient numerical and technological superiority. 47 human vessels entered the battle. 0 exited. Supreme Admiral Torathoran Vass transmitted the engagement report to the War Council at 1700 hours Fleet Standard Time. The report was concise. Objective achieved, human outer sector fleet neutralized, anticipated resistance to territorial expansion eliminated, recommend proceeding with Phase 2 of the expansion protocol. The War Council received the report with the specific satisfaction of an institution that had spent 3 years planning an operation and had watched the operation execute with an acceptable variance. The satisfaction lasted 6 days. On the 7th day, a signal arrived at the War Council's Deep Space Monitoring Station from a frequency that the station's classification system flagged as unregistered. The signal contained a single text transmission, in Keth standard, clean, and precisely formatted. It read, "We received your message. We are preparing our response. Please advise your civilian population in the outer territories to relocate to the inner sectors. This is a courtesy notice. You have 30 days." The War Council read the transmission. The War Council read it again. The intelligence director said very carefully, "The fleet was confirmed destroyed, all 47 vessels. We have the engagement telemetry, we have physical confirmation from the debris field." The strategic analysis director said, "The transmission frequency is not in our registry. It is not any frequency we have on record for human communications." The War Council chair said, "Find out who sent this." It took the intelligence division 4 days to find out. What they found was not what they expected, and what they expected had already been significantly revised upward from what they had known before the 6 days of satisfaction had ended. The Director of Intelligence presented the findings to the War Council on the 11th day after the engagement. He said the transmission was sent from a location in the Ardennes corridor, approximately 3 light-years beyond the engagement zone. The location contains no registered human installation. It contains no registered anything. It is, according to our charts, empty space. He said it is not empty space. He put the sensor data on the display. The War Council looked at the display. The display showed something that the War Council's collective experience had not prepared it to categorize immediately, not because the objects were unidentifiable, but because the number of them required a moment of recalibration before the number became real. The strategic analysis director said, "Those are warships." The intelligence director said, "Yes." The strategic analysis director said, "How many?" The intelligence director said, "Current count is 430. Our deep field sensors are still resolving the outer formation. The number may be higher." The War Council was quiet. The War Council chair said, "Those cannot all be human vessels. Human military capacity does not support a fleet of that size. Our assessments." The intelligence director said, "Our assessments were based on the fleet we destroyed. I want to explain what we now know about that fleet." He changed the display. He said the 47 vessels we engaged and destroyed were human. Their construction, their crew signatures, their weapons systems, all confirmed human. Our engagement telemetry is accurate. We destroyed what we destroyed. He said what we did not know because the information was not in our intelligence files, because the information was not available to us through any channel we were monitoring, was that those 47 vessels were the human colonial defense force for the outer sectors. They were the vessels that the outer sector colonies maintained for local security, protection against piracy, emergency response capability. They were not built for engagement with a military force the size of what we deployed. He said they fought anyway. The engagement telemetry shows that clearly. They fought with everything they had, in a formation that was designed not to win but to buy time and to ensure that every piece of data from the engagement was transmitted to somewhere we were not watching before the last vessel was destroyed. He said they knew they were not going to win. They fought anyway. And while they were fighting, something was happening 3 light years away in the Ardennes corridor that our sensors were not pointed at because we believed the threat was in front of us. He changed the display again. He said the Human Colonial Defense Force is a structure that exists in all human colonies as a matter of standard practice. It is funded by the colonial authority and crewed by local personnel. It is the visible military presence, the presence that is registered in the galactic community's records, the presence that appears in our intelligence assessments. He said, what is not in our intelligence assessments, what is not in the galactic community's records, what is not registered anywhere that we were looking, is what the humans call the strategic reserve. He said, the strategic reserve is not a secret in the sense of something the humans have been concealing through active deception. It is not concealed. It is simply not discussed. It is not registered because there is no galactic requirement for civilizations to register military capacity that is not actively deployed. It is not visible in the records because it has never been deployed. It has existed for 41 years, since shortly after humanity's first contact with the wider galactic community, and in 41 years it has never been used. He said it has never been used because in 41 years, no situation has arisen that required it. He paused. He said, we have created such a situation. The War Council was very quiet. The chair said 430 vessels. The intelligence director said 467 as of 20 minutes ago. The outer formation is still resolving. The strategic analysis director said, our current deployment is 212 warships in the engagement zone and the Phase 2 force of 140 vessels in staging position. Total 352. No one said the next thing that the numbers implied, because it did not need to be said. The chair said the transmission, 30 days courtesy notice. The intelligence director said, yes. The chair said they gave us 30 days to move our civilians. He said it the way you say something when you are trying to determine if the words mean what you think they mean, and the answer keeps being yes. The intelligence director said the transmission used the phrase courtesy notice. That phrasing is specific. It implies that the notice is being given as a matter of choice rather than obligation. They did not have to send the transmission. They chose to. The chair said, why? The intelligence director said, I have been thinking about that for 4 days. I have a hypothesis. He said, in the 41 years since first contact, the human record in the galactic community has been consistent in one specific way that our War Council assessments did not weight heavily enough. Every significant conflict involving humans, every fleet engagement, every territorial dispute, every resource confrontation has resulted in outcomes that were negotiated rather than dictated. Not because humans were in a position of military weakness that required negotiation. Because humans consistently chose negotiation when military options were available. He said, I believe the 30-day notice is consistent with that pattern. They have the capacity to begin their response immediately. They have chosen not to. They have chosen to send a transmission giving us time to reduce civilian exposure before they respond. He said, I believe they are communicating something specific by doing this. They are telling us that what comes next is a military response to a military action, and that they are making a distinction between our military and our civilian population, and that the distinction is intentional and will be maintained if we do not force them to abandon it. He said they are offering us a chance to limit the damage. The War Council chair said, by relocating our civilians. The intelligence director said, and presumably by whatever else we decide to do with 30 days. The chair said this is not how military responses work. You do not warn the enemy, you do not give them time to prepare. The intelligence director said, Supreme Commander, with respect, I think that is precisely the point. They are not conducting a military response. They are conducting something that does not have a category in our operational frameworks, because our operational frameworks were built for situations where the goal is victory, and I am not certain that victory is what they are pursuing. The chair said, what are they pursuing? The intelligence director said, I think they are pursuing a specific kind of outcome. which is one where we understand very clearly what we did and what the consequences of it are without the understanding requiring us to be destroyed in order to receive it. He said the fleet we destroyed was their colonial defense force. It consisted of vessels crewed by people who lived in the colonies, families, people who had built things in the outer sectors. When we destroyed those vessels, we destroyed those people, and the people in the colonies knew it, and the colonies sent the information to the Ardennes corridor before the last vessel went down. He said the strategic reserve has been waiting for 41 years. The people in it have spent 41 years knowing it might be needed and hoping it would not be. The courtesy notice is from people who have just received confirmation that their worst case has arrived, who have the capacity to respond immediately and overwhelmingly, and who are choosing to give us 30 days to relocate civilians before they do. He said, I do not think this is weakness. I think this is the specific human version of telling us exactly how serious they are, which is to demonstrate that they are serious enough to have been prepared for 41 years and also measured enough to send a warning before they act on that preparation. The War Council was silent for a long time. Then the military operations director said, what are our options? The intelligence director said, I have identified 3. The first is military engagement. We deploy everything we have, including reserves not currently in the outer sectors, against the force in the Ardennes corridor, based on current numbers and our assessment of the reserve's capabilities, which is necessarily incomplete because we have no engagement data for these vessels. Our probability of a favorable outcome is not something I can calculate with any reliability. He said, the second option is withdrawal. We pull our forces from the engagement zone and the Phase 2 staging position and return to our inner territories. We send a communication acknowledging the engagement and requesting terms. He said, the third option is the one I want to present to the Council, which is also the one that I have the least precedent for, which is to contact the source of the transmission directly and determine what they actually want. The chair said what they want is retaliation for the destruction of their fleet. The intelligence director said, that is the assumption. I am not certain it is correct. I am not certain because the transmission did not say retaliation. The transmission said response. And the specific framing of the courtesy notice, the specific choice to give us 30 days and to tell us to relocate civilians rather than to simply begin the response, is not consistent with an entity that wants to destroy us. It is consistent with an entity that wants us to understand something, and is taking the approach most likely to produce that understanding. He said, I want to know what understanding they want us to have. I think that conversation is more useful than the alternatives. The chair was quiet for a long time. He said, you believe they will talk. The intelligence director said, I believe the 30-day notice is an implicit invitation. I believe the frequency the transmission was sent on, which is unregistered and which we had to work to identify, was chosen deliberately. I believe if we respond on that frequency, they will answer. He said, I may be wrong, but the cost of trying is a communication. The cost of not trying is whatever comes after the 30 days. The chair said, open the channel. The response came in 3 hours. Not from a government official, not from a military commander. The voice that answered on the unregistered frequency belonged to a woman who identified herself as Dr. Amara Osai, and whose title, she explained, was not military but academic, specifically Professor of Strategic Communication at the Human Galactic Affairs Institute, and whose role in the current situation was, she said, to have the conversation that needed to be had. The War Council chair said, you are not a military officer. Dr. Osai said, no, the military officers are occupied with the formation in the Ardennes corridor. I was asked to handle this part because this part is a conversation and I am better at conversations than they are. That is not a criticism of them. It is a description of different skills. The chair said the formation in the Ardennes corridor, 467 vessels. Dr. Osai said 491 as of this morning. The outer elements finished their positioning overnight. The chair said, you are telling me this to communicate the scale. Dr. Osai said, I am telling you this because you deserve accurate information and because the specific number matters less than the fact that you should have accurate information when we have this conversation. What would you like to know? The chair was quiet for a moment. He said, I would like to know what you want from this conversation. Dr. Osai said, that is the right question. Thank you for asking it directly. She said, what we want from this conversation is for the Keth sovereignty to understand what happened 11 days ago, why it happened, and what the consequences of it are in a way that allows both of us to make informed decisions about what comes next. She said the fleet you destroyed was the Colonial Defense Force, 47 vessels, crewed by 1,240 people. Those people had families in the outer sector colonies. Those families are now without fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, people they were expecting to come home. That is not a strategic asset count. That is 1,240 specific people who will not come home and the specific people who are waiting for them who will not see them come back. She said, I want you to understand that clearly before we discuss anything else. Not so that you feel a particular way about it. So that the decisions made from this point forward are made by people who know what they are deciding about. The chair said, I understand what was lost. Dr. Osai said, I want to be careful here because I think the word understand can be used in two ways. One is understanding as a factual acknowledgement. 1,240 people were killed, their families are affected, this is the number and the nature of the loss. The other is understanding as something more than that, something that involves actually sitting with what the number means rather than just knowing the number. She said, I am not asking you to feel responsible in a way that is paralyzing. I am asking for the second kind of understanding, the kind where the number is not just a number but represents something real, because the decisions that come next need to be made by someone who has the second kind of understanding. The chair said, you sent a courtesy notice giving us 30 days to relocate civilians. Dr. Osai said, yes. He said, why? She said, because we are not at war with your civilian population. We are at war with, or more accurately in a state of serious conflict with, the entities that made the decision to deploy 212 warships to destroy a colonial defense force that posed no strategic threat to the sovereignty's core interests. Those are not the same population. She said, and because we believe, based on 41 years of observation of the Keth sovereignty, that the decision to deploy was made by a relatively small number of people in a relatively small number of rooms, and that those people do not represent the full range of positions within your civilization, and that the full range of positions includes people who would have counseled differently if they had been consulted, or if the decision had been slower, or if the information available had been more complete. She said, we did not want to harm people who would have counseled differently, because the people who did not counsel differently put them in harm's way. The chair was quiet. He said, you have 491 warships, the strategic reserve, 41 years of preparation, and you are having this conversation instead of using it. Dr. Osai said, we are having this conversation because a response that is calibrated and considered produces better long-term outcomes than a response that is immediate and overwhelming, and we are in the business of long-term outcomes. She said, I want to tell you something about the strategic reserve that is not in any record you would have access to, because it has never been committed to an external record, because the people who made the decision to build it did not want the existence of it to change how other civilizations related to humanity before the relationship had matured enough to handle the knowledge. She said the reserve was built in the years following first contact, when it became apparent that humanity was entering a galactic community that had established dynamics, established power structures, established ways of resolving disputes, and that humanity did not fit neatly into those dynamics in ways that would always protect it. The people who built the reserve were not militarists. They were planners. They looked at the situation and they said, we are going to be in the galactic community for a long time. There will be situations we cannot anticipate. We should have the capacity to respond to those situations without being dependent on the goodwill of entities whose goodwill we have not yet established. She said they built the reserve and they hoped it would never be needed, and they maintained it across 4 decades because hope is not a strategy. She said, when the Colonial Defense Force transmitted their engagement data to the Ardennes corridor 11 days ago, the people in the reserve received it. They knew what it meant. They had been waiting 41 years for the worst case to arrive, and the worst case had arrived, and they spent 6 days discussing what to do before anyone sent the courtesy notice. She said the discussion was not about whether to respond. The response was never in question. The discussion was about what kind of response, and what the response was for, and what outcome a response should be trying to produce, and what the people who had just lost 1,240 colleagues and family members deserved from the civilization that had sent the fleet that killed them. She said that discussion produced the courtesy notice and this conversation, because the conclusion of the discussion was that what those people deserved, What we owed them was a response that was proportionate and considered, and that produced a better future rather than simply a satisfying immediate reaction. And a satisfying immediate reaction that left the sovereignty in ruins would have required rebuilding a relationship with whatever came after, and we are very tired of rebuilding relationships from ruins. She said, we have been doing that for 200,000 years among ourselves. We would like to try a different approach with the rest of the galaxy. The chair said, what does the different approach look like? Dr. Osai said, it looks like this conversation, and the conversation that needs to happen after this one, and the conversation after that. It looks like you understanding what happened and why, and what the reserve exists and what it means, and what we are and are not prepared to accept as terms for continuing in a state that is not active conflict. She said, we are not asking for capitulation. We are not asking for tribute. We are not asking for territorial concessions beyond what was taken from us in the engagement zone, which we want returned to the status it held before Phase 1. She said, what we are asking for is a formal acknowledgement of what happened, a formal commitment to a structure that prevents it from happening again, and a direct conversation with the people in your government who make military deployment decisions about what the existence of the reserve means for the risk calculus of future decisions. The chair said, you want to educate our war council. Dr. Osai said, I want your war council to have accurate information. Whether they are educated by it is their choice. But yes, the specific failure that produced this situation was an information failure. Your war council did not know the reserve existed. They assessed human military capacity based on what was visible and concluded that the outer sector fleet was the primary and sufficient threat. That assessment was incorrect, and the incorrectness produced a decision that cost 1,240 lives and has produced the current situation. She said, I would like to give your war council the information that would make that specific miscalculation impossible to repeat. She said, not as a threat, as information. Your war council can do whatever it chooses with accurate information. I trust, and I want to be clear that this is trust rather than certainty, that people making decisions with accurate information make better decisions than people making decisions with incomplete information. She said, your intelligence director requested this conversation rather than defaulting to the other options. That suggests to me that the quality of decision-making in your council is sufficient for this approach. I am choosing to act on that suggestion. The chair said, you investigated our intelligence director. Dr. Osai said, I reviewed the record of the request. The choice to contact us was his recommendation, and the council acted on it in 3 hours rather than 3 days. That tells me something about the quality of judgment in the room. She paused. She said, I want to be honest with you about something. The conversation we are having right now is the conversation that the 47 vessels were buying time for. When they held the engagement zone for 4 hours and 11 minutes against a force that overwhelmed them, they were not trying to win. They were transmitting everything they had to the Ardennes corridor and buying the time for this conversation to be possible. She said, 1,240 people died so that I could speak to you today, instead of 491 warships speaking for themselves. She said, I want you to know that. Because the decisions you make from this point forward are decisions made possible by that specific choice. And I think the people who made that choice deserve to have the decisions it made possible be worthy of what it cost. The chair was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, what do you need from me to begin the conversation your council is asking for? Dr. Osai said, I need you to tell me who in your government is actually authorized to make the commitments that this situation requires. Not the war council collectively. The specific people who can make binding decisions and who will still be in those positions in 5 years, because what we are building, if we build it, needs to last longer than the current political configuration. She said, I also need you to tell me something personal if you are willing. The chair said, ask. She said, the intelligence director who recommended this conversation. Who is he? Not his title. Who is he? What does he value? What has he spent his career doing that produced the judgment to recommend this over the alternatives? The chair said, why does that matter? She said, because the structure we build is going to be built by people, and the people it's built by are going to shape what it is. And I want to know who those people are before I make commitments on behalf of the ones who bought this conversation with 4 hours and 11 minutes and 1,240 lives. She said, they deserve to have the people on the other side of this be worth knowing. The chair said, His name is Sevorin Talas. He has been in intelligence for 30 years. His family is in the outer territories. He has spent his career studying civilizations that the War Council characterizes as threats and finding in the record things that the War Council would rather not see. He paused. He said he was on the fleet that went to Ardennes IV 18 years ago, the colonial food supply operation. He was the first officer on that engagement. He had family in Kethorum 7. He came back from that operation and filed a supplementary report that the War Council classified and that I have read 17 times in 31 years because every time something like this happens, I find something in it that was relevant that I did not act on the first time I read it. Dr. Osai was quiet for a moment. She said he knew Marcus Adami. The chair said he did. He brought coffee home from Ardennes IV when they left. He told his daughter about it. She became an archivist. She is very good at her work. Dr. Osai said, I know. She contributed to a research project we were involved with 7 years ago. Small world. She said, I want Sevorin Talas in the conversation. I want him specifically. The judgment he used to recommend contacting us is the judgment that needs to be in the room when we build whatever comes next. The chair said, I will arrange it. He said the 30 days, we will use them to relocate civilians from the outer territories. I want you to know that this is not purely strategic. I want the people in those territories to be safe, not because they are strategic assets, because they are people. Dr. Osai said, I know, that is why we sent the notice. The chair said, how did you know we would respond this way? You could not have been certain. Dr. Osai said, we were not certain. We were choosing to act as though the best case was possible and see if the evidence confirmed it. The evidence has confirmed it. You called instead of deploying. Your intelligence director recommended conversation instead of engagement. You are asking me who Sevorin Talas is as a person rather than as a military asset. These are not the behaviors of an institution that wants a war. They are the behaviors of an institution that found itself in one, and is looking for the way out that does not require everyone to lose everything to exit it. She said, we have been watching the Keth sovereignty for 41 years. We have a very large file. The file contains the record that you sent to Ardennes IV and came back with a supply agreement. It contains the record of the Adami Clause and the 3 sectors that adopted it. It contains the record of every fleet operation and every diplomatic engagement and every small decision made by individuals in your government that was better than the institution required them to be. She said, we built the reserve because we needed to be able to protect ourselves. We sent the courtesy notice because the file suggested there were people in your government worth protecting the possibility of this conversation for. She said, so far the file is accurate. The chair said, I would like to read that file. Dr. Osai said, some of it can be shared. We will discuss which parts in the next conversation. She said, the next conversation should include Sevorin Talas and a diplomat named Sira Nkosi who has experience with the Keth sovereignty, and who I am told has a very good thermos of tea and the patience to build things that take a long time to build. The chair said, Ambassador Nkosi, I know that name. Dr. Osai said, most people do eventually. The chair said, I will arrange the meeting. Dr. Osai said, I will send the agenda. It will be detailed. We prepare carefully for conversations that matter. The chair said, I have been told that about humans. Dr. Osai said, it is true. It is one of the truer things about us. She said, one more thing before we close this part of the conversation. The chair said, tell me. Dr. Osai said, the 47 vessels, the 1,240 people, their fam. Iles are in the outer sector colonies. In the next 30 days, while your civilians are relocating, I want to ask that no action is taken in the outer sectors that would make the situation of those families worse than it already is. Not as a condition of the next conversation. As a request from one person to another because those families have already lost what they have lost, and they do not need to lose more while the formal process is finding its way to a resolution. The chair said, no action will be taken in the outer sectors for the duration of the 30 days. He said, I want to add something to that, not as a formal commitment, as a statement of intent that I want on the record of this conversation, whatever record you are keeping. Dr. Osai said, we are keeping a complete one. He said the engagement should not have happened. The intelligence was insufficient. The decision was made on incomplete information and the consequences of it are what they are. I cannot undo them. What I can commit to is that the decisions made from this point forward will be made with better information, and that the better information will include a complete understanding of what was destroyed when 47 vessels were destroyed, which is not just a fleet but the people in it and the people who were waiting for them. He said, "Put that in the record." Dr. Osai said, "It is already there." She said, "I am going to ask you something that I ask at the end of conversations that I want to continue. I find it useful to know the answer because it tells me where the next conversation should start." He said, "Ask." She said, "What do you wish you had known before today that you know now?" The chair was quiet for a moment. He said, "I wish I had known that the fleet we destroyed was not what we thought it was, not strategically, in the sense that you described, in the sense that it consisted of people with families and specific lives and names that someone knows and is waiting to hear again." He said, "And I wish I had known that the capacity to respond to destroying it would be used for this conversation before anything else. That the people in the reserve spent 6 days in discussion before sending a warning. That the warning said relocate your civilians because we are not at war with them." He said, "I wish I had known what kind of species we were dealing with before the decision was made that made this conversation necessary." Dr. Osai said, "That is exactly where the next conversation starts." She said, "I will send the agenda. It will be longer than the first one. Please have tea available. We find the conversations go better with it." The chair said, "I will consult with someone about the correct preparation." Dr. Osai said, "Ask Sevorin Talas. He has experience with it." The channel closed. The War Council chair sat in the council chamber for a long time after the transmission ended. Around him, the council was processing what had just happened, which was a process that would take considerably longer than the conversation itself, because what had happened was not the thing any of them had prepared for when they had authorized the engagement 11 days ago. They had authorized the destruction of a threat. What they had actually done was introduce themselves. The introduction had been made in the worst possible way, through a decision based on incomplete information that had cost 1,240 lives, and had triggered the deployment of 491 warships that had existed for 41 years without anyone outside humanity knowing they were there. And the response to the worst possible introduction had been a courtesy notice and a conversation with a professor of strategic communication who kept a complete record and asked at the end of conversations what you wished you had known. The chair thought about the file Dr. Osai had mentioned. 41 years of observation. Every fleet operation, every diplomatic engagement, every small decision made by individuals that was better than the institution required. He thought about Sevorin Talas, who had been on a fleet to a colony 18 years ago and had come back and filed a supplementary report that the council had classified, and that the chair had read 17 times and had not acted on and was now looking at the consequences of not acting on it. He thought about the 47 vessels that had held the engagement zone for 4 hours and 11 minutes, not to win, because winning was not possible, but to transmit everything they had and buy time for a conversation to be possible. He thought about what Dr. Osai had said about what those people deserved, that the decisions made possible by what they had done be worthy of what it had cost. He called Sevorin Talas. He said, "You recommended the conversation. The conversation was productive. I want you in the room for the next one." Talas said, "Yes, Supreme Commander." The chair said, "On. More thing, the supplementary report you filed after the Ardennes IV operation, 18 years ago. I have read it 17 times. I want to know what you think I missed in it." Talas was quiet for a moment. He said, "Everything that was in it, Supreme Commander. You read it and you understood it as a report about a supply chain. It was a report about people. The difference between those two readings is the difference between this conversation happening 18 years ago and happening today." The chair said, "I know." He said it the way you say something when the knowing arrived too late to change what it should have changed. And what you are left with is the knowing and the determination to apply it to what comes next. He said, "We will not miss it this time." Talas said, "No, Supreme Commander, I do not think we will." He said, "They have a file on us, 41 years, every good decision anyone made. They were watching for the people who were worth building something with." The chair said, "And they found them." Talas said they sent a courtesy notice and a professor. I think that means yes. The chair said prepare for the next meeting. The agenda will be detailed. Talas said I will bring tea. The chair said they asked that you would. Talas was quiet for a moment. Then he said she remembered about Ardennes IV. The chair said they keep everything. Talas said yes, that was in the supplementary report too. He said it quietly, as a man says something that he has known for 18 years, and is finding confirmed in a way he is not sure whether to find reassuring or humbling or both. The answer, he decided, was both. The record which the humans kept and which was complete would note that the meeting that followed was the beginning of the Ardennes Accord, which established the framework for Keth-human relations that the subsequent decades built on. The record would note the agenda, the participants, the terms agreed to, the commitments made, the structure built. The record would also note, because it was complete and the humans kept everything, that the first thing Sevorin Talas did when he arrived for the meeting was hand Sira Nkosi a small package. She opened it. Inside was coffee from Ardennes IV. She looked at him. He said, my daughter sent it. She said it was appropriate. Sira Nkosi said, your daughter is correct. She made coffee. They had the meetings. The record noted that too. All of it.